Well, hello, good evening. Welcome to the Norwich Bookstore and another great virtual event from our fall events calendar. We're kind of wrapping up for the year, but we thank you all who have joined us for one or more of these author events over the past season. My name is Sam. I work here at the Norwich Bookstore, and if you are here in the Upper Valley locally, you might recognize me from behind the counter or running crazily around the store. And from wherever you're joining us tonight, welcome. We thank you for being here and for supporting these great readings. Tonight, I am very, very excited to be digging into talking about Imaginary Peaks, a really fascinating book, new book from Katie Ives, and I can't wait to hear more about it in just a moment. But before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping announcements to make, and I hope that you will indulge me while I do so. The first one actually is about those books. Tonight, we are here to celebrate Imaginary Peaks. Now, we've got signed copies of Imaginary Peaks. Katie was nice enough to stop by the store last night and put her autograph on a big stack of them. So if you love what you hear tonight, and I expect that you will, want to know more about this story and more about this book, I encourage you to pick up a copy. Imaginary Peaks is available here at the Norwich Bookstore. If you're local or in the Upper Valley area, we are happy to put one aside for you at the store or put it out for porch pickup on the front porch. Or if you are from further afield, we can ship books to you. We ship via USPS Media Mail, and we'll send a book anywhere in the country for you. Either way, I'm going to drop a link to purchase Imaginary Peaks in the chat tonight. I'm also going to drop links to purchase books by Sean Prentiss, who will be in conversation with Katie. And I hope that you'll take a look at those and see what you might enjoy. These readings and everything that we do here at the bookstore is supported by your book purchase. And that is also what keeps authors like Katie Ives and Sean Prentiss writing. It is what keeps nonprofit literary presses like Mountaineers Books producing books like this. It is what keeps magazines like Alpinist going. So please don't be shy. We really appreciate your support. And as you know, the holidays are coming. Books make great gifts, especially signed books. So hope you'll check out those links. Now, the Norwich Bookstore, we've been here since 1994 here in Norwich, Vermont, and we are known for our great author events. We usually have a full schedule going. Tomorrow night, we've got Franz Nicolay in conversation with Adam Wilson. And in a couple of weeks, we've got Jodi Picoult in conversation with Chris Bojalian in an in-person event here in the Upper Valley. So please, if you enjoy what you're hearing tonight, I hope that you will check out our events calendar. NorwichBookstore.com is where we've got that. I'll drop a link in the chat. We've got an email newsletter that we send out once a week that has other events we've got going on. And you can also follow us on social media, and we encourage you to do so and find out what else we have happening. We hope that we'll see you back here sometime soon, either virtually or in person. I also want to extend a thank you to Alpinist Magazine for supporting tonight's event and co-sponsoring. And you'll be hearing about that magazine from Katie and the amazing work that they do, that she does with the magazine. And we are grateful to their support. So thank you very much. Now, tonight, if you have questions after the event, we will get to as many as we can at the end of the evening. You can put your questions in the chat bar to the side of the screen, or at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A module. It just says Q&A on it. You can open that, type your question in. And like I say, we will get to as many questions as we can answer at the end of the event. So keep them coming. We always get great questions from this crowd. And thank you so much again for being here. Now, I am so delighted tonight to be here with Katie Ives and Sean Prentiss talking about Imaginary Peaks. This is a fascinating read. It is a book that I am really excited to hear more about. And it is a book that really delves, I think, into the very nature of what it is to be an adventurer in whatever way you identify as such. And no better person to write it, I think, than Katie Ives. Katie Ives is the editor-in-chief at Alpinist Magazine, and her writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, Outside Magazine, The Rumpus, and Adventure Journal, as well as in anthologies like Rock, Paper, Fire, The Best of Mountain and Wilderness Writing, and Waymaking, an anthology of women's adventure writing, poetry, and art. In 2016, she received the H. Adams Carter Literary Award from the American Alpine Club. She's participated in the Banff Mountain and Wilderness Writing Program and has served as a judge for the Boardman Tasker Award and a jury member, panelist, and panel moderator at the Banff Mountain Book Festival. She lives in Cambridge, Vermont, and Imaginary Peaks is her first book. Joining Katie in conversation tonight is Sean Prentiss. Sean Prentiss is the award-winning author of Finding Abbey, The Search for Edward Abbey and His Hidden Desert Grave, which won the 2015 National Outdoor Book Award, and Crosscut, poems, a memoir and poems about his time as a trail builder in the Pacific Northwest. Sean's the co-editor of The Science of Story, the brain behind creative nonfiction, and he's also the co-author of 2 textbooks, Environmental and Nature Writing, a Writer's Guide and Anthology, and Advanced Creative Nonfiction, a Writer's Guide and Anthology. He's also Backcountry Magazine's Poet Laureate. And wherever you're joining us from tonight, I hope you'll join me in giving a warm Upper Valley welcome to Sean Prentiss and Katie Ives. Thank you both for being here.
Sam and Norwich Bookstore, thanks so much for hosting this event. And Katie, I am super excited to be talking with you tonight. As you well know, every once in a while I pop into the Alpinist offices, and you and I get to talk writing. And that was a few years ago since I last got to do it. So I'm excited to be talking writing with you tonight. And the first thing I want to have you do is to read a little bit from the book. I just finished the book last night, loved it. As Sam said, it's fascinating, and we'll talk a lot about it. But I was thinking maybe you could read about the sleeping system. And I thought that might give us a good understanding of who Harvey Manning is, one of the main characters, and just a little bit about his voice and about hoaxes in general. And we'll dive into more of the book.
Okay, yeah. So when I started researching the history behind the Riesenstein hoax, which was the creation of an imaginary range of mountains in British Columbia, I learned that the person who was behind the hoax, a man named Harvey Manning, was also the person behind a series of other hoaxes. And one of his earliest ones from the late 1950s involved coming up with a fake kind of self-warming sleeping bag that was supposed to be a spoof of the post-war climbing gear industry, and passing it off as a real design in Summit Magazine. So this is just the story behind that hoax, which in some ways was practice for the Riesenstein hoax. I start off talking about Dale Cole, who was a friend of Harvey Manning's and was involved in some of his hoaxes. And Dale is actually still alive. He's in his 90s now, and he's still climbing mountains. I recently met him when I was out in Washington, so that was pretty cool. All right, so here we go. To understand Harvey Manning and his hoaxes, Dale Cole told me, people needed to understand the burgeoning outdoors industry at the cusp of the 1960s. We saw the climbing culture itself change, Dale said. New manufacturers moved into the scene, and they were selling their materials for prices that we thought were cruel and high. There was another breed of climber who took climbing far more seriously. Not that we didn't do serious climbing, but it wasn't a question of bragging about it in an arrogant way. Well, Harvey was particularly put out by this kind of climber, especially their accounts of accomplishments in climbing journals and magazines, depictions that made an ascent more of an ego trip than a climbing trip. As you well know, climbing dates and climbing facts and bragging rights and exaggerations come up in articles submitted to climbing magazines and misrepresent what's really there. Harvey himself said, facts and fiction read the very same way in print. So on August 1st, 1959, Harvey wrote to his friend Ted Beck, detailing plans for his first known prank on the gear industry. Incidentally, Harvey wrote, I'll be calling on you shortly to take a proper part in the great hoax. While down at the REI Co-op in June, I picked up a copy of Summit Magazine, and the thing irritated me, especially all the pseudo-scholarly crap about sleeping bag research. So I wrote a long circumstantial letter to the editor describing a research project being carried on by the Cougar Mountaineers, of which I, H. Hawthorne Manning, am president. Dale Cole is going to follow up with some correct and further research as chairman of the Sleeping System Committee. Ideally, we hope dullards from all over the country are taken in and start criticizing the system. We can then answer them. having the tremendous advantage that we can invent all the necessary research and statistics, while they will be dependent on fact. Actually, this is proposed merely as a test. The experience should prove useful for a later hoax, unplanned, involving the American Alpine Club. Maybe we could discover a new climbing area in the Cascades, the Crazy Creek Crags. Crazy Creek is a third tributary on the left of the blank river. This has to be a real river. We would need a real climbing party, like Becky Manning and Cole. Stand ready to take action, but keep it quiet, since only about 4 people are in on the thing. It's a very promising lead. Might, in the long run, be possible to destroy the whole sport of climbing. Yours for mutual self-destruction, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Katie, thanks so much for reading that. And then the actual letter gets even more ridiculous. And then we're off and running. And I remember talking to you about your book project many, many years ago. And all you told me at the time was that you had a contract and you were writing and researching, and that I'd have to wait until the book came out. And now I've read the book, love the book, but I'm thinking back to that beginning, and I'm thinking about when you first discovered the Reisenstein hoax. And if you could just introduce us when you discovered it, and then also maybe just talk about when you realized that this could be the beginning of a book project.
Sure. So I first read about the Riesenstein hoax in Andy Selter's book, Ways to the Sky, which is a classic history of North American mountaineering. And Andy wrote just a few paragraphs about it. And to me, it seemed like the greatest story ever. And, I wonder why nobody else had written about it. Apart from other people had written about it in magazine journals, or they'd made references to it in guidebooks, but there hadn't been a book about it yet. And that surprised me. And I started digging around a little bit more. And at the time, one of the people who was involved in the hoax, a man named Austin Post, was still alive. So I was able to correspond with him and hear some of the backstory. I should probably explain a little bit for people who aren't familiar with the Riesenstein hoax, exactly what it is. In 1962, readers of Summit magazine, which was then the only monthly climbing magazine in the US. So this was long before Climbing Magazine or Rock and Ice or Alpinist. They opened the pages of the magazine to see this photo, and it was of a range that few, if any, climbers had ever seen before. It was a real photograph, but the range was described as allegedly being called the Riesenstein Peaks and allegedly existing in British Columbia. And along with the photo, there was an article about 3 Austrians who allegedly hiked past the confluence of the Quality River and the Stena River and bushwhacked through dense forest to get to the base of these extraordinary towers. And to American climbers in the early 1960s, looking at these mountains, they seemed like just on the verge of what might be climbable. It was right around the time that people had just begun to climb some of the big walls in Yosemite. The nose had been climbed in the late 1950s, but those were all in a sunny location. As long as you didn't get caught in a storm, you could be reasonably secure about weather. And whereas these peaks, there were depictions of hanging glaciers, there were clouds boiling on the horizon, like storms coming in. It looked like a very cold and remote place. So in a way, it was sort of that notion, which Yvonne Schneider was being talking about at the time, of taking the skills learned from the big walls of California and applying them to the great granite ranges of the world. So it came at the perfect moment. And American climbers began writing to Canadian map offices, wanting to find out more about the Riesenstein Peaks of British Columbia. And they learned very quickly that the Riesenstein Peaks of British Columbia didn't exist, that where there are mountains in that location, there are very different kinds of mountains. So, and they also learned that the Quality River didn't exist as well. So it was pretty clear that this was a hoax. There is a real place called Riesenstein. It's a cluster of boulders in Heidelberg, Germany. So that began a search for a number of climbers to find out where the real location of these mountains were. It was obvious that they were real. It was obvious that they didn't exist in British Columbia. It seemed that nobody had climbed them. And so it took a few years before people were finally able to identify them as the Kichatnas, which a series of mountains southwest of Denali. And that began in 1965, the first climbing expedition to go out and try to climb the peaks. So so I became really interested in why this hoax was so appealing to climbers at the time, and what it is about imaginary mountains in general that is so incredibly enticing. I think for myself, it was something that I've been interested in ever since I was a child. Growing up in the lowlands of Massachusetts, I'd had recurring dreams of a giant mountain in my backyard that didn't exist. And that dream had sort of stuck with me throughout adulthood, long after I moved west and began climbing real mountains. That somehow none of the real mountains I climbed ever quite matched up to this imaginary peak in my recurring dreams. And by sheer chance, many years later, I hadn't read Henry David Thoreau growing up, but I read some of his journals after somebody else told me that he'd written about a dream mountain. And I found out that he'd had a very similar recurring dream of an imaginary mountain in Concord, Massachusetts, which was just a few miles from where I grew up and was essentially the same mountain. And, obviously I didn't think there was anything to this coincidence that was supernatural, but I did think there was something about human psychology to it, that there's something about this desire for mountains, this desire for imaginary peaks, this desire for sort of apexes that kind of bridge the gap between the earthly and the unearthly, that seems to resonate across centuries and across cultures. And that was something that I wanted to understand better as well. And once I started looking into the history of the Riesenstein, I began to realize that it was only one of many imaginary ranges that existed in North America, that existed around the world. And that, in fact, the more you start looking for them, the more they turn up absolutely everywhere. And I had found out a potential one not far away from where I live in Vermont. I found out about another one in my hometown. So it seemed like there was this sort of fascinating kind of alternative topography that existed of peaks that didn't exist.
Yeah, and your book dives into peak after peak, hoax after hoax, and we'll touch upon more of that in a little bit. But we had a question from the audience. They were wondering who took the photo. They're asking if it was Washburn, and I don't think it was Washburn.
No, there's an interesting story about Washburn and the Kichatnas. In 1965, after David Roberts, who recently passed away, after he became one of the first people to identify the Kichatnas as the real location of Riesenstein, he went to Bradford Washburn, who was very famous for taking aerial photographs of Alaskan peaks and Canadian peaks, and who had a huge collection of them in his office, the Museum of Science. And he asked Brad, why didn't you take a picture of the Kichatnas? Because David had looked through all these photos and hadn't seen the Riesenstein. And Brad said that he had in fact seen them from his plane, but that he thought the weather was so terrible that nobody would ever want to climb them. So there was no point. So the real person who took the photos was in fact Austin Post. He's very well known in the Northwest, maybe not as well known in New England as Brad Washburn, but Austin was inspired by Brad Washburn. But his primary interest was glaciers. He was a self-taught glaciologist and glacier photographer who flew all over North America taking photos of every glacier possible. He'd taken hundreds of thousands of them by the time he passed away. And in this case, he was taking images for a book that came out in the early 1970s called Glacier Ice. And it was while he was flying over Alaska, photographing glaciers, that he saw these extraordinary and surreal peaks, and took a picture of them and brought it home and showed it to Edward LaChapelle, who was his co-author on Glacier Ice, and to Harvey Manning, who was a mutual friend. And the three of them started kind of fantasizing about imaginary ranges and started drawing, sort of lines of, potential routes that, a climber might take to the summit. And then that spun out into sort of fantasies about this group of Austrians that had tried to climb them.
And since you brought up Austin, Ed, and Harvey, so the book begins with the Reisenstein hoax, and then it gets into just a plethora of hoaxes. And then by the end, it really becomes sort of a biography of those three men as we head towards the conclusion. And one of the things I was wondering as you were writing, or as I was reading your writing, is if one of those, who was your favorite to write a biography of? Who was the one you were most drawn to? Was it Austin, the photographer, Ed, or Harvey?
Well, I was able to find the most information about Harvey. Harvey there's more than 125 boxes of Harvey's unpublished manuscripts that you can find in the University of Washington Special Collections. If anyone wants to write a full biography of him, the material is all there. He literally saved everything he wrote down. If he had a passing thought and scrawled it on a piece of scrap paper, he saved that. So it was an amazing opportunity to be able to dig through all these sort of scraps of paper and loose notes and old letters and feel like it was a chance to kind of inhabit somebody else's imagination. And much of what he wrote about were mountains, both real mountains and imaginary ones. So, having learned that Harvey was the kind of mastermind behind the hoax, I did end up spending a lot of time trying to understand what his influences were and what his motivations were in creating these elaborate hoaxes. But yeah, and enjoyed learning more about the other men as well. Edward LaChapelle, for those who know about him, was famous as an avalanche researcher and a snow scientist. He wrote beautifully about snow and had an approach to the mountains that was at once scientific and poetic. One of my favorite stories about him is that because he wanted to listen to the faint sort of gradations and differences in snow, like things that he couldn't see but could hear, he attached a tape recorder to his skis and would record the sound of snow crystals as he skied over them, which he wrote about really beautifully. Austin Post was also a fascinating person. He dropped out of high school because he was severely bullied as a boy, and went on to become one of the most respected glaciologists. Ended up getting an honorary PhD at the end of his life, having never graduated from high school, and had this just extraordinary vision of the beauty of glaciers and the beauty of mountains. And today his photos are being used by climate change scientists because they have this record of what the glaciers look like going back to the 1950s, thanks to Austin. So yeah, they were all, I think, really fascinating. And, it's interesting too, to think about the three of them together and their friendship and how that resulted in this sort of fantastic story.
Yeah, not only a fantastic story, but also a ton of conservation and preservation change that they brought about besides this. But in just about everything you talk about, the word imagination or imaginary comes up. And I'm thinking about a quote from the book, American geographer Roderick Peety. He wrote, "A mountain is a mountain because of the part it plays in the popular imagination." And this idea, it comes through time and time again in your book. And so does the idea of mystery. Those two just weave through the entire book. And I'd love to hear you talk about the idea of imagination and mystery and how they're infused in mountaineering and also in mountaineering lore and hoaxes.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting was when I started researching mountains and imagination, realizing that even real mountains in a certain sense have a kind of fictitious nature to them, in that geographers don't agree even what a real mountain is. I think people in the Northeast were used to thinking about our mountains, they're 4,000, 5,000, at most 6,000 feet, and they look like mountains. They're above tree line, they're covered in alpine tundra. In the wintertime, they get covered with rime. They have the feel of mountains. But, you go to some place like Nepal and there's 10,000 foot hills that are just described as hills, and they have farms on them and terraces and trees. So I think there's no sort of universal standard for how high something has to be, how prominent it has to be, how steep it has to be in order to be considered a mountain. And that was why Roderick P. had come up with what my favorite definition for mountains is that mountains are mountains because of the role they play in the popular imagination. If a landform has a special significance in the dreams, in the culture, in the storytelling of the people who live at its base, then it's a mountain. So you kind of get into this idea that mountains are inherently attached to the imagination. They're inherently attached to dreams. They're inherently attached to aspirations, spiritual as well as secular. And, I think that there's certainly a strand of mountaineering. I mean, so you see kind of, there's a lot of times when you look at mainstream depictions of mountaineering, you see an emphasis on, firsts, on records, on who did it the fastest, who collected the most peaks over, 8,000 meters the most quickly, or whatever. And there's another side to it, and there's that side that's more sort of the spiritual side, the way that people have approached these formations for thousands of years as places that for them can sort of serve as bridges between the earthly and the unearthly, as places that can't be entirely measured or quantified, that represent something that's divine or represent something that's sublime to them.
Well, and I'd love to talk more about that, because one of the really powerful things about your book is it's about a hoax. And then it looks at all these other hoaxes, and then it looks at mountaineering. But then it starts really critiquing both hoaxes today, based on where we are with our news cycle, but also what cost mountaineering explorations and all of that has had on local communities. And so, overall mountaineering has small global ramifications. People land somewhere, they climb a peak, and then they go home. But some of them are much bigger. And I'm thinking about how mountaineering has led to work to erase some cultures that have lived upon the land by calling those areas where they live blank spots. And even more dangerously, a lot of these expeditions, whether real or hoaxes, are designed to steal land from other cultures. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about the dangers to some of these hoaxes and to expeditions in general.
Yeah, I think, mountaineering has mountaineering in the way that it's been practiced in the West, in its sort of dominant Western form, does have a long history of being intertwined with the history of colonialism and the history of imperialism. Certainly you sort of think about images of, people planting flags on summits. You think about people renaming mountains that had indigenous names. You think about people mapping areas, and then those maps at times then being used to facilitate invasions. So there's definitely there's a long history of complicity between mountaineering and colonialism and mountaineering and imperialism. I think, and that's, the very notion of terra incognita is itself, as many people know, is an inherently problematic one, because there are very few parts on the earth that were genuinely unknown by human beings until the 19th century, and Antarctica basically, or maybe a few corners densely hidden away in difficult to access places, but for the most part the world was extremely well known. There were names to these peaks. There's a lot of archaeological evidence of local people making early ascents of mountains around the world long before mountaineering history became something official. So I think one of the terms that I latched onto when I was doing my research was one that Carl Thusch came up with in his book Native Seattle, saying instead of terra incognita, we should be talking about terra miscognita, or sort of misunderstood land rather than unknown land, because that very notion of these sort of blank spaces was in itself a myth. Another thing that interested me as well is that the idea of blank spots on the map is it did have a particular history. There was a French cartographer, Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville, who in the 1700s was introduced the idea of blank spaces on the map. Before then, when you look at medieval maps or earlier maps, if people hadn't been to a place, they filled it in with rumors and myths about it. They filled it in with secondhand reports, or simply what they dreamed was there. And d'Anville said, well, if a European hasn't been to an area, then it's a blank place on the map. And that was kind of where you got that notion of erasing terrain, erasing histories, erasing names, erasing previous cartographies until the European explorer arrived, which has obviously been devastating in a lot of ways.
So I just think of my own life and my love of maps. And if you set a map in front of me, I'll just study it for hours on end. And I love just all that talk about the power of maps and how they can steal a land or misappropriate it. And just a little tangential question: do you have a favorite map?
Yeah, I have a lot of favorite maps. My dad collected maps when I was a kid, so I kind of grew up looking at old maps. And I think what's sort of fascinating about maps is that I think for a lot of us they're like stories. They're Eric Shipton, the British explorer, talked about how much he loved dreaming over maps and planning out expeditions that he never thought would never actually take place, and how he'd had these imaginary expeditions and all around the world looking at old maps. And I think there's sort of an inherent tendency to look at a map and to imagine yourself there. And then there's also the question of what's not in the maps, and those are stories in and of themselves. And I think over the years I've become much more interested in what isn't in the map versus what actually is. But I think in terms of some favorite maps, there's a wonderful atlas called Shem Pete's Alaska. It was put together by Alaska native man named Shem Pete, who had hiked something like more than 13,500 square miles of Alaskan backcountry, just all over the place, and collecting stories from various indigenous people. And then he'd worked with some professors at the University of Alaska to create an indigenous atlas to part of the Alaska range. And if you go to it, you can see the sort of maps of the early white explorers like Joseph Heron with the original native names written back on top of them. So it's a really wonderful map in terms of kind of restoring that erased history. Another map I really like is there was a map in the early 1700s by a man named John Senex of the English Empire of America. And it shows this mountain range going from Michigan all the way down to Florida. And if you spend any time in Florida, there's obviously no mountains there. So, that kind of fascinated me. And I wanted to know more about the history of it. Why did he think there was this big mountain range in the state of Florida? So that's another favorite. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I love the medieval maps. There's a map by a Moroccan cartographer from 1154 that was apparently one of the most realistic maps of Europe, Africa, and Asia, parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia at the time. And it was done on silver, and it's been lost. So I like to think about that lost map.
Well, speaking of those maps, especially, I guess all three of them, I'm thinking about technology. And, if we go back to the 1100s, and that map, the technology was just so different. And if we go back to Terra Incognito and those blank spots, for so long, mountaineering worked without really much technology and without a lot of knowledge of what was the biggest mountain in the area, how big was it, where did it start, where did it end, all these things. But then slowly technology advances, and then quicker and quicker and quicker. But then as it advances, hoaxes become much harder to perpetrate, and expeditions become much less about mystery and more about something else, maybe conquest or experience. And I'm just thinking about how technology, it seems to me, steals both mystery and the imagination. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about your thoughts on technology and their role with hoaxes, mystery, imagination, exploration, any of that.
Yeah, well, there's a book by Nicholas Carr called The Shallows. And it's the main part of the book is sort of talking about the effects of the internet on people's brains. But there was a part where he talked about maps, and I thought it was really interesting, where he said that, sort of each form of kind of cartographic technology, going back to paper maps, that, as we start to rely on them, parts of our brain that are related to spatial representation begin to shrink. And I thought about that growing up as somebody who wandered the woods without, obviously I didn't have the internet because I'm old, but I also didn't use paper maps as a kid. I just learned about the terrain simply by wandering and having sort of a vague sense of direction based on the position of the sun in the sky. And how you relate to a landscape when you're experiencing it that way versus how you relate to it when you have a map and you're kind of looking for a particular destination and you're trying to get from point A to point B. It can change your interaction with nature. But I think it's, in many ways, the question whether hoaxes are harder to perpetrate now. I mean, it depends on the kind of hoax. I think it was early 1980s, David Roberts wrote a book called Great Exploration Hoaxes. And towards the end, he's kind of talking about the future and imagining that hoaxes will be harder and harder to perpetrate. And he says, well, back in the 16th and the 17th century, when people were going off and writing books about imaginary voyages, nobody was expecting to come back with photos as documentary proof that they'd actually been to these sort of fantastical islands that they were writing about. But, by the time you got into the 1960s, all of a sudden there was all this documentation. And, and then today, of course, you have situations where mountaineers are expected to produce GPS tracking to prove that they've been on a particular mountain. But it has another side to it. I mean, the technology also enables hoaxes. You get into, sort of more basic stuff like, stories about climbers photoshopping themselves into summit pictures, or more sophisticated, we look at the rise of deep fakes and what can be done with that it may actually become even harder to spot hoaxes in the future as technology becomes more sophisticated. But technology doesn't end mystery. There's a very famous story that probably a lot of people know of Sandy Island in 2012, which was an island that was on a bunch of maps, including Google Earth. And in 2012, some Australian scientists happened to be sailing in the area on a research trip and thought they'd check it out and discovered there was absolutely nothing there. And so that kind of, there's still these sort of errors and glitches and possibilities for things that have escaped map makers even today. So I think the world remains much less well mapped than a lot of people realize, which is one thing that I found fascinating as I was doing my research.
Well, and the other fascinating thing that you wrote about is what they did with Sandy Island, and by they, just random people that wanted Sandy Island or the idea of Sandy Island to remain. You write about how they put little icons back on the map, castles or islands, just so there'd be something there, some mystery there, which I love that.
Yeah, Alistair Bonnet, who wrote about Sandy Island, a book called Unruly Places, described it as a rebel base for the imagination, which I thought was a cool description.
Well, and one thing you've done throughout, which just amazes me because sometimes I forget my own middle name. I ask a question and the author, the year it was published, the title of the book. And when you read your book, it is just infused with research. And the research is seamlessly woven in from beginning to end. This book is just a stunning quilt of ideas and research. And I'm wondering how you researched this book and how you pieced it all together, because it just seems like a beautiful and monumental task to keep it all cohesive?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I worked on it in bits and pieces over a number of years. Started working on the book in 2014, and then I actually, like, I think, was it 2019, I took 3 months off work to do some more work on it. And then 2020, when I was kind of getting down to the wire in terms of my book deadlines, at that point, I had something like 600 pages of stream of consciousness mixture of notes and random thoughts and, you know, semi-written chapters. And I spent about a month and a half, like, somehow squishing that into a vaguely coherent narrative, which then took even more time, of course, working with editors to turn into a book. But, you know, I just got really interested in the repeating patterns that I saw again and again throughout history, and wanted to, I think, sort of saw the book in a way as providing a resource for other people who might be interested in the topic. I wasn't able to find anything else that really went in depth and specifically in the history of imaginary mountains. And so, yeah, so that was part of what I was trying to do. And, you know, you'd sort of see, you know, there'd be the similar kind of symbols that would turn up again and again. You know, I think one of the most frequent patterns that you see in Western history of imaginary mountains dates back to the Middle Ages, when people believed that Eden, or the earthly paradise, existed on some impossibly high mountain somewhere in Asia that had escaped the Great Flood. And this mountain apparently had a huge cascade next to it with the deafening sound of waters. And you see that image of the improbably high mountain and the Great Cascade replicated over and over and over again in Western writing, and eventually it becomes separated altogether from its, you know, original connection to Eden, and it's just sort of this idyllic place that people dream of reaching. So yeah, it was sort of stuff like that. It was like these names that came up over and over again, these particular valleys, like the fantasy about Shangri-La and how that gets repeated over and over since the 1930s, that I wanted to trace out in the book.
Well, you do an amazing job with both the book, which is just a beautiful story of Harvey, the hoax, mountaineering lore, other hoaxes, but also with that research. I mean, it is just a stunningly researched book as well. We're getting down to the last few minutes, and I was just wondering if there's anything else that you wanted to talk about, any ideas that I didn't touch upon that you wanted to chat about before we open it up to the Q&A.
Yeah, I don't know. There's so many ideas. You know, I think one thing that I found fascinating was, you know, looking at writings that other people did about imaginary mountains, and this notion that the mountain represents, that appears both in like Carl Jung's writing, the Swiss psychologist, and then also in some fantasy books that I read, this idea that an imaginary peak represents some kind of inmost desire of the person who creates it. And that those desires can be sort of negative as well as positive. That, you know, René de Mal wrote about in Mount Analog, which is one of the most famous books of an imaginary peak. He wrote about this mountain that was something like supposedly taller than Mount Everest, and it was invisible and it existed on an island where space was curved, so you could only see it at certain moments. And, you know, he talked about 2 expeditions that went out to try to experience it, encounter this mountain. And the first one was motivated by curiosity, was motivated by a desire to have some kind of contact with the transcendent, with the divine. And then the second expedition thought that there might be oil and other riches buried in this mountain, and they went off to try to conquer it. And the second expedition arrives near the island, and they start, you know, prepare to shoot at the local residents, and instead get caught up in a whirlpool. And, you know, that's the end of that. But so there was this idea that I thought was fascinating, that these mountains have kind of both sort of an alluring side, but also an unseemly side. And, you know, trying to kind of navigate that becomes in many ways sort of a metaphor for looking at the sort of positive and negative sides of mountaineering in general.
Well, Katie, thanks so much for talking with me. It was a pleasure to read your book, and it was just awesome to hear your ideas on imaginary peaks. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you to both of you, Katie Ives, Sean Prentiss. Thanks so much. Fascinating conversation, wonderful conversation. We've dropped links in the chat to Imaginary Peaks and also to Sean Prentiss's book, Finding Abbey, another interesting story of adventuring myth and lore. So do check that out as well. We're going to do some questions. If you've got questions, do drop them in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen, or you can also put them in the chat for me. And we got a few minutes for questions, so keep them coming. Thank you to those who have put them in already. We got a question from Bill, who asks, what were some of the repeating patterns in history that you like the most from your research of this book?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was, I already mentioned my interest in the story about Eden and the search for Eden. You look at the history of medieval map making and exploration, and people initially were imagining that Eden could be found on this mountaintop in Asia, and then when it was clear that it wasn't there, they moved it to other parts of the world, and that was fascinating to me. This idea that people thought that paradise was something that could be mapped. And Alessandro Scotti, who's an Italian historian, wrote about it as a place that was on the earth in the medieval imagination, but not of the earth, which I thought was a really interesting distinction. I was also really interested in non-Western myths of imaginary mountain landscapes. In Buddhism, there's the legend of Beul, which are these paradises. They're hidden inside the walls of peaks. And there's a story from 1962, which is the same year that the Riesenstein hoax took place, of a Buddhist expedition that went to Kangchenjunga, trying to get inside the mountain and trying to open the door to this paradise within the mountain. And that was, you see kind of a cultural appropriation of that myth in the story about Shangri-La, which is a secret alpine paradise written about in a British fantasy novel, and has continued to play a role in the Western imagination. So that was another repeating image that I traced a lot in the book.
Thank you. We've got a question about some specific mountains, non-mythical mountains. Someone in the Q&A is asking whether you have any opinions on how challenging you consider Mount Whitney, and also Mount Washington or Mount Katahdin here in New England. Have you climbed any of these peaks? Do you have any thoughts on their challenges?
Yeah, I actually haven't climbed Mount Whitney, although I've climbed in the Sierra. I somehow never got around to Whitney. I've done I've been to the summit of Washington many times since I was a child. Climbed some of the technical routes in Huntington's Ravine. There's, as many people know, there's some wonderfully classic ice routes in Huntington's Ravine. There's also some really great rock climbs there. And yeah, there's great, moderate, accessible climbing on the peak, as well as, of course, the hiking trails as well. Same with Katahdin. I've only ever hiked up Katahdin. I haven't done any of the climbing routes on it yet, but I've heard really great things about the climbing on that mountain.
Thank you. One question that Sean kind of touched on a little bit with his question about technology and the ways that that's sort of changed the way this story was told. But with changes in technology, with changes in climbing culture in the last 50 years, do you think that a hoax like this could happen today in the climbing world?
Yeah, it's interesting because I went through like this really long back and forth with some other mountaineering writers about whether they thought someone could create an imaginary range, perhaps in some part of the Karakoram that isn't where foreigners don't have access necessarily to good maps because of the political sensitivities of the region. I think that the consensus was that it would be very difficult to create an imaginary mountain, but that, perhaps somebody might be able to create an imaginary rock face or something and have an expedition that went up a non-existent rock face. But that's all dependent on just like how intensely editors actually fact check. I think anybody who's a climber who reads mainstream accounts of various climbing feats in newspapers, there's all kinds of bizarre misinformation that turns up, and and climbing magazine owners make mistakes too, and certainly I've made mistakes, so it's there's definitely an element of human error that comes into play. And one thing I wrote about in the book was in 2005, before I was even thinking about going into all this research, before I'd heard about the story of the Riesenstein hoax, I was sitting in a cafe during the Banff Mountain Book and Film Festival, and this very famous European alpinist came up to me, and he was going on this long rant about modern climbers. They all they care about is promoting themselves in magazines and claiming first ascents, and who knows if they've ever actually been near those mountains, and it was everything that Harvey Manning had talked about back in the 1960s. And the next thing I knew, the guy was saying it'd be really funny to kind of play a hoax on some climbing magazine, and I just looked at him and I was just like, yeah, that would be funny, but please don't play that hoax on me. Pick another magazine.
Well, speaking of magazine work, we got a question here. How did your work with Alpinist and your personal climbing experiences affect how you were thinking about this book project?
Yeah, I think it did definitely had an effect. One of the things that I've been really lucky to be able to do working at Alpinist over the years is to work with climbing writers around the world. And I think any time that you're working with somebody on their writing, you get to see their own sort of creative process as it unfolds. You get to get a glimpse of the world through their memories and also through their imagination. So I felt like I had this in a way, I had this very sort of privileged access to a sort of vast unconscious, a vast terrain of sort of the climbing unconscious in a way, that definitely sort of fueled my own understanding of the climbing imagination. And then also, I think, there were some of the peaks that I talk about in the book, I'd originally learned about through alpinist articles, particularly Nanda Devi, which is a real mountain, but has a really interesting history around it that relates to the history of imaginary mountains. And that was something I first learned about from Pete Takeda, who had written a history of Nanda Devi for Alpinist.
Thank you. One thing about this story is, and you touched on this at the beginning of the talk, is that the characters, the major players in this hoax were like pretty well known and pretty interesting folks who had a lot of like long histories in the climbing community, and some of them, like, we know their books today. Was there anything in your research that you uncovered either about these guys or about the story itself that really like surprised you?
Yeah, I think my biggest moment of surprise was when I was at the University of Washington Special Collections, and I was digging through the Harvey Manning boxes. And at the time, I'd interviewed a lot of people about Harvey and his interest in hoaxes. I'd read some descriptions of the Riesenstein hoax in history books. But what I wasn't expecting to find was such an extensive correspondence discussing his plots for various hoaxes, and every detail minutely planned. And to find that evidence just right there was absolutely delightful, and also to see just clearly how much he enjoyed the whole process and the jokes that he and the other hoaxers, the other people involved in the hoax, were exchanging in their emails. That it just made it all come alive for me.
As you were researching other hoaxes in the climbing community, are there any examples of women climbers or mountaineers creating or participating in these hoaxes?
That's a really good question. Obviously, the editors of Summit Magazine, which was the magazine that published Harvey's hoaxes, were both women. And, as I write in the book, in a way, they had started out with kind of their own act of concealment, which was when they founded Summit as the first US monthly climbing magazine in 1955. They were concerned that nobody would buy the magazine if they knew it was being published and edited by women. So they simply listed their names with their first initials on the masthead. And then when people wrote in addressing them as dear sirs, they didn't correct it. So you see these sort of early letters saying dear sirs, addressing the two women who were publishing the magazine. So in a way that was a little bit of a prank, eventually people figured out that they were women, and by then the magazine was established. They also, I think I came to the conclusion that there was a good chance that they knew that these articles that Harvey was sending to them were hoaxes, and that they published them, hoping out of a sense of mischievousness themselves, also hoping they would help sell magazines. Jean Crenshaw, who was one of the editors, had told me that she liked to have a lot of sort of intense letters to the editor, because Summit had become known for its letters to the editor section that helped sell magazines. She's also said she liked to stir controversy. And when I asked her about the Riesenstein hoax, all she told me was that it sounded like something she would do to somebody else. So yeah, so there's that question of whether or not they're involved. In terms of women planning climbing hoaxes, yeah, I haven't, it's interesting because I didn't come across any particular stories related to imaginary mountains that were presented as real. I did come across stories written by female authors about imaginary mountains that were presented as fiction. Daphne du Maurier has a wonderful short story called Monte Verita, which is kind of like a feminist version of Shangri-La, which I definitely recommend if you haven't read it. It's sort of one of those often forgotten classics. And then just when I was out in the Northwest, I heard about a group of women climbers in the mid-20th century who, there was one of them wrote a column about all the mistakes in all the ways that Fred Becky's guidebooks were getting people lost. And she referred to, every time she got lost, apparently she referred to as, and I found myself in the Enigma range. So, that was an imagined range that she had created, although of course it was being presented as fiction. Well, I mean, she was really lost there, but the range itself didn't necessarily exist. So yeah, those are some of the closest stories that I came across. But yeah, it's definitely a good question. I think, I think for much of climbing history, women had so much pressure on them to prove themselves as mountaineers, as climbers. And I think, maybe they didn't feel that they had the kind of luxury or the sort of privilege in order to be able to carry out a hoax like that.
Oh, thank you. Couple of comments I'm seeing in here. We're seeing climbing advice in the Q&A box, of course. Someone says Whitney walk up pretty easy if you have the permit and take the normal trail and can handle the elevation. Other than that, it's just long. Hopefully, some folks are inspired to go out and do some mountaineering in the coming season. And someone's asking, where can I get signed copies of Imaginary Peaks? Well, you can get them here at the Norwich Bookstore. And we've got a link in the chat to that. You can also check out our website, norwichbookstore.com. You can order the book there. And I do have signed copies here at the store while supplies last. I could ship them anywhere in the country for you. So do hit that link in the chat and place your orders. And thank you again to Katie for signing those books. One more question for both of you in the few minutes we have left. What are you guys working on now, each of you? What's the next project?
Katie, do you want to go first?
Oh, well, you want me to? Talking so much.
Okay. I have a few projects, but I'm working on a collection of poetry, actually 3 separate books that all take place right outside my windows. So one of the books takes place almost directly in front of me on the cove I live on. And so that's just a book about natural events and the science behind it, told through poetry. And then a book of poetry that I just started working on about the mountain right next to me, Woodbury Mountain, which is getting turned into a wilderness preserve as we speak. So I'm going to be the poet for very much poems about that. And then I'm writing another collection of poems that details my move here from Michigan and settling on this lake and against this mountain. So those are the projects I'm working on right now.
Yeah, so I'm back to working full-time on Alpinist. This is the latest issue, which we have advanced copies now, and I guess it's just started to reach subscribers. So I'm actually working on issue 77. That was 76. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, once I recover from the exhaustion of trying to write a book and be a magazine editor at the same time, I do have another book I'd like to write. Yeah, I've been kind of plotting it out in my mind already.
Cool. Well, good luck to both of you, and I'm really hoping that when these new books come out, when they finally reach us here in the world, that we'll be able to host events here in our bookstore in Norwich again, and we'll make sure to invite you for an in-person reading as well. We are so grateful to both of you and to everyone out there tonight. Thank you so much for spending your Thursday night with us, and what a great event it has been. I put another link in the chat to Imaginary Peaks. It is the new book by Katie Ives. Here it is, fresh out from Mountaineers Press, and these are signed copies while supplies last. So if you hit that link, norwichbookstore.com, we'd be happy to ship you a signed book, and we thank you again for your support. And thanks to Alpinist Magazine for supporting tonight's event. And as Katie said, new issue just hitting subscribers now, another new issue coming in the new year. So if you think you might want to check that out and even subscribe, you could do so at Alpinist. I think it's Alpinist. Is it alpinist.com or .org? There's a link in the chat in any case, and do hit that and see what they've got going on. Thank you so much, Katie Ives, Sean Prentiss. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you guys this evening. And to all of you out there tuning in from wherever you are, be safe, be well, read good books, do good work, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.